Hey everyone, Chris here. Thanks for checking out the podcast. If you're enjoying it and learning something along with us, please consider becoming a supporting patron at patreon.com/ateachershistory. Or you could leave a rating and review on iTunes. It would be a huge help. If you'd like to raise your hand and participate along with us, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, @ateachershistory, or shoot me an email, chris@ateachershistory.com. All right, let's get on to the next episode. Hello, and welcome into A Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining us again today. Did you know that the Battle of New Orleans happened after the Treaty of Ghent was signed?
Did you know that the Battle of New Orleans didn't actually take place in New Orleans?
And that the Battle of New Orleans sparked a revival of national unity and enthusiasm for the next generation of Americans. Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out because today we will cover that and more in episode 106, Extra Credit, the Battle of New Orleans. All right, everyone, welcome into episode 106. It is an extra credit episode, Battle of New Orleans, and Bill Gorman is here once again with me on the pod, and we're going to dive right into it. Welcome back, Bill.
Back once and again. This is round 2. I'll own it. So yeah. So we've had a couple issues. I posted on social media earlier this week, the week we're recording it. We've had a couple surgeries for family members over the last few weeks. Bill and I actually recorded this episode once, and the audio software didn't work. And then Bill and Zach travel all over the place for work, and I do at times too. So, in my defense, really, this software company just needs to get with the times, right? I mean, not supporting the latest Mac OS updates, that's Bush League.
Yes. Good. Do you feel better now?
I do, because There's nothing I like more than trying to pass the buck.
Okay. Well, that's good. Well, that's what you and I have in common. That's why we get along so well, because we just pass the buck back and forth. So today, Bill and I are going to dive into the Battle of New Orleans here on episode 106. And I think that right now it's helpful to sort of set the stage for where we are in the War of 1812. If you've been listening to these episodes live, it may have been a little while, a couple weeks since you listened to our most recent episode, but if you're sort of pounding through all of them and binge listening, then this might be fresher in your mind. So up to this point in the War of 1812, while Andrew Jackson's putting down the Creeks in the South, we have to remember what else is going on in this war. The British had defeated the French, and they decided they were going to turn their attention and manpower in 1814 to the United States and punish them for having the audacity to fight this war in the first place. Then you have the Battle of Bladensburg, or the races at Bladensburg, the Bladensburg races, whatever you want to call them. Madison was the first and only president in this battle to ever command on a battlefield. Following the British victory, they then march on Washington, D.C., burn the White House and the Capitol building and many other public buildings to the ground. And meanwhile, another British army was in Maine, seizing significant portions of land in Maine, which was technically a district of the state of Massachusetts at this time. It wasn't a state yet. And then late summer, early fall of 1814, about 10,000 British troops traveled down from Montreal and fall to the U.S. Navy at the Battle of Plattsburgh, in what was a pretty miraculous victory for the United States Navy. While this was happening, the British Army from D.C. was heading north to take out Baltimore, but with the Battle of North Point and Fort McHenry, the British were unsuccessful. And it's important to note here at the Battle of North Point, General Robert Rolfe who was shot at North Point, was scheduled to be the commander at New Orleans, but he had to be replaced. So that brings us to the most memorable battle. I don't want to say pivotal battle because I don't think that would be accurate, but the most memorable battle of the Battle of 1812, and that is the Battle of New Orleans. The United States and Britain had begun negotiations for an end to the war, and these negotiations started in August. But in October, orders had actually been sent from London to Major General Edward Pakenham to continue fighting, even if he heard rumors of a negotiated peace. Now, you may be wondering, why would Britain tell their generals to keep fighting if there's rumor of a negotiated peace? Well, many in London, including the Secretary of War Henry Bathurst, were concerned that even if the British and the US came to a peace agreement, it still might not be ratified. And as you can imagine, if an agreement is agreed upon but not ratified, it doesn't go into effect. Therefore, it's not officially completed. It would have needed to be ratified by both Parliament in London and Congress back here in the United States. So the British wanted to make sure they did not miss an opportunity to put their men in a bad position by counting their eggs before they hatched. So that sort of sets the stage for why the British are continuing to push forward with an invasion of New Orleans, even though their ambassadors or their diplomats are currently negotiating with the American commissioners at this time. And that brings us to the main character in today's episode, one Mr. Andrew Jackson. Jackson was born from a Scots-Irish background. He was born in the Carolinas, right along the line, really, between North and South. And during the Revolutionary War, he was a courier for the militia. And Bill, I'm not sure if you knew this or not, but when Andrew Jackson was young, he was captured by the British, and a British officer demanded that he polished his boots, and Andrew Jackson, being Andrew Jackson, refused, and probably didn't do it so politely. The British officer then struck Andrew Jackson on the head and his hand with his sword. Andrew Jackson still had scars on both his head and his hand from this encounter when he grew older. As I'm sure you can imagine, this event created quite a bit of distaste for the British from Andrew Jackson. And I think that is putting it mildly. In reality, he hated the British. He was then orphaned and moved to Tennessee. He became a lawyer and businessman. He bought a plantation. He bought slaves for that plantation. Then he was sent off to Congress to represent the state of Tennessee. Jackson was so well respected and admired, he was given command as a major general in the Tennessee militia. He was given command then of the 7th Military District, which makes up present-day Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Jackson's primary responsibilities were to defend Mobile and the port city of New Orleans. Zach and I discussed Jackson's role in the Creek War in episode 105 and how Jackson was relentless in his pursuit of the Creeks. At the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, known as a battle of extermination, no quarter was given to the Creeks. And Andrew Jackson took that very hardcore attitude toward all of his enemies in war as the years progressed, even after the War of 1812 wrapped up. And this brings us to the Battle of New Orleans. As I mentioned, Andrew Jackson was in charge of the 7th Military District, which included Louisiana. He was specifically in charge of defending two major cities, Mobile and New Orleans. And word came, or Andrew Jackson eventually found out, that the British were, in fact, trying to invade New Orleans. So, Bill, why were the British going toward New Orleans? What was special about that city that caused them to focus their attention upon it?
Well, Chris, if you think about it, New Orleans being the prize target for the British makes a certain amount of sense. As you just said, it will kind of blow your mind to know that Andrew Jackson did not initially believe the British would attack New Orleans. Instead, he thought it would be elsewhere in the Gulf Shore region initially, such as Mobile or Pensacola. New Orleans, though, ultimately was the target that made sense for the British to try to capture. First, New Orleans is a port town. Its docks
still is.
I think
it hasn't gone totally underwater yet.
I was just there. I can tell everyone that it is still a port town. Its docks and warehouses stored a tremendous amount of supplies and munitions. It was estimated that nearly 3.5 million pounds of cotton were stored in those facilities. Chris, to give you a sense of the scope of what that represented monetarily, it would be equivalent to the price the United States paid for the entire Louisiana Purchase. So, needless to say, capturing that level of supply depot would be crippling to the American war effort and ultimately the American economy. Speaking of the Louisiana Purchase, the British knew that if they could take New Orleans, they would effectively control access to the Americans' ability to gain traction in their new land gain. War, in large part, is about real estate. The Mississippi River represented the gateway to the Americans' westward expansion that Thomas Jefferson secured through the Louisiana Purchase. If the British could cut the Americans off, that would give them leverage, theoretically, at the negotiating table. Perhaps even enough for them to be able to annex portions of that land, perhaps corners a portion of that off for the indigenous peoples, etc. Now, the third reason why the British wanted control of New Orleans also revolves around the Mississippi River. If the British controlled New Orleans, that would have meant they controlled the gateway to the river that ultimately led to Canada in the north and then ultimately the Gulf in the south. The British could then link their forces from one end of the Mississippi to the other. And so for those reasons, that's why, based on my read, even though there may or may not have been peace negotiations, armistice overtures during this time, that is why I believe New Orleans was so pivotal to the British war effort and the American war effort, for that matter.
Gotcha. All right, very good. So that is going to be the focus of our episode today. And it makes sense that the British were going to go after New Orleans, as you mentioned. It really is it starts at the mouth of the Mississippi. So it leads into the Mississippi. And keep in mind, at this time, the British were trying to execute an invasion of the Chesapeake. They were invading the state of New York. They were invading the District of Maine. And so this is sort of like hitting all four sides, so to speak, the north, the west, the east, and now the south. So as we move into setting the stage for New Orleans itself, I think it's worth going through at least what was happening right into the lead up of the actual battle. In mid-December, the British Navy was not far from New Orleans, Louisiana. At the Battle of Lake Borgne, 60 British ships anchored in the Gulf of Mexico to the east of Lake Pontchartrain and Lake Borgne under Admiral Alexander Cochrane. Americans prevented their access to the lakes, which led to the Battle of Lake Borgne, in which the British Navy overwhelmed the American gunboats and eventually did gain access to the lakes. Jackson, unfortunately, through this battle, why this battle is important is he loses critical recon. These Americans who were defending on these gunboats down by Lake Borgne were feeding him information on the British movement. After this battle, Andrew Jackson, things go a bit dark for him. The British then set up their camp about 30 miles outside New Orleans while they tried to determine what their next action would be. Subsequently, they began to move closer to the city. They used whaleboats and trekked through the swamps and the bayous of Louisiana, which, as I'm sure you can imagine, is some tough mudding. Literally. On December 23rd, a vanguard of 1,800 British soldiers reached about 7 miles from the city of New Orleans. Keep in mind, the next day, December 24th, the Treaty of Ghent was signed. So they were preparing for battle literally as the diplomats for both the British and the Americans were finalizing their peace negotiation. New Orleans at this time, on December 23rd, when the British were just about 7 miles from the city, New Orleans was undefended, and the British likely could have taken it, but they decided to wait for reinforcements. They then invaded the home of Major Gabriel Villers, who was able to escape through a window, so the story goes, and warn General Jackson of the British advances. There are also some reports of other people being able to warn him. Either way, the important thing is that late December, as the British were getting closer to the city of New Orleans, Andrew Jackson is then warned just how close they are. With that news, in typical Andrew Jackson fashion, he aggressively took about 2,000 men and attacked the British vanguard, which was a really bold action because he was going in blind, not knowing exactly what he was going up against. But in the end, it was a great decision because the city of New Orleans was undefended. Each side suffered about 200 killed, wounded, and missing. Now, when you think about who won this battle, it doesn't really matter who tactically won. The British maintained their tactical position, so you could argue they won, but they were given a really rude wake-up call, realizing that this conquest of this port city of New Orleans was not going to be as easy as maybe they previously thought. This caused the British to delay even more. Basically, Pakenham realized that what he thought would be an army of pushovers was definitely not going to be, at least if Andrew Jackson was any indication. Buying himself some time, Jackson turned all of his focus toward fortifying the canal for the ensuing British invasion of New Orleans. After General Pakenham, General Keane, and Admiral Cochrane met, they decided, due to the urging of Admiral Cochrane, to attack the American forces head-on, believing the superior British army could easily dispose of the American amateurs. In the last week of December 1814, after the British recon force had withdrew, the Americans got to work fortifying their lines about 5 miles from the city in a town called Chalmette, Louisiana. In what became known as Line Jackson, the Americans did everything they possibly could to make life incredibly difficult on their British enemies. They installed 8 batteries and had 2 24-pound and 2 12-pound guns on the grounded warship USS Louisiana. Jackson had a little less than 5,000 men, with only about 20% of them being regulars or Marines, the rest being made up of militia or volunteers. While he was heavily outnumbered by the British, the American defenses would eventually prove to be impenetrable. And Bill, do you want to just sort of paint the picture? I know we both went down to the Chalmette battlefield in New Orleans somewhat recently. Do you want to sort of paint the picture for, and of course I'll post stuff on social media, maps of the battlefield so everyone can see it if they're listening to this episode, but do you want to paint a picture for what exactly it looked like?
Yeah, I think the most effective way of painting this picture is from the perspective of the British forces that would eventually be marching against it. And so,
makes sense.
If you were a British, still redcoat, literally marching against this fixed position, what you would have seen is a wide open field with no cover on it, just an open field. Staring at you to your left is the Mississippi River. To the right, a swamp. In front of you, you would have seen a canal, what looks like a moat. You would see a rampart that was built about 8 feet high with guns on them that were just looking straight down at you. If you were to look to your left, you would have also seen howitzers pointed at you, artillery position. So, needless to say, what you'd be looking at would have been a pretty daunting defensive position.
Yeah, and so you have the British looking out at an open field, and they are looking at a heavily defended American line. And like you mentioned, there's the Mississippi River to the left, and there's swamps to the right, and there's really nowhere to go for them. Additionally, on the other side of the Mississippi, there was some heavy artillery also. And of course, the grounded ship in the river, the USS Louisiana, ready to fire. So at this time, there are a couple people that are important to remember on the British side. Sir Alexander Cochrane controlled the British Navy, really hated the U.S., and had been partaking in some pretty questionable and brutal tactics along the coast. And then you have Sir Edward Pakenham, who was given control after Ross was killed at the Battle of North Point. So just south of New Orleans, and Bill, we learned about this a little bit, is Barataria Bay. And do you remember the name of the pirate who basically ran everything in Barataria Bay?
Yeah, literal pirate, Jean Lafitte.
Yes. The pirate Jean Lafitte, Barataria Bay was the home of the largest group of pirates in the Western Hemisphere, headed up by none other than Jean Lafitte. He had over 50 ships and 500 men working for him. And what they were doing is they were stealing stuff out of the Spanish ships and then selling them to the public in New Orleans. Now, Jean Lafitte was not viewed as an upstanding gentleman, so to speak. And at first, the government in New Orleans wanted nothing to do with him, and Jackson really wanted nothing to do with him. But over time, Jackson realized...
Chris, not only did he want nothing to do with them, Jackson is quoted as referring to Jean Lafitte and his Baratarians as a band of criminals and as hellish banditti. So, strong words from Mr. Jackson.
Yeah, that's pretty bad. But over time, Jackson realized that this hellish banditti could help him win the battle. So he took advantage of that, and he started to scheme with Jean Lafitte. And he used him and his men not just for supplies, but also for knowledge of where the British could be coming from, what routes they may use, etc. And so Andrew Jackson basically set his men up in the best possible situation. On January 1st, about a week before the battle, the British were hoping that they could send some initial fire that would knock out the American guns, put a couple holes in their defenses. But after they were finished, they realized they'd not destroy any American guns, and the wall remained intact. So Britain had to figure out exactly how they were going to approach this seemingly formidable defense from the Americans. Well, their plan was to go right at them. On January 8th, 1815, the Battle of New Orleans commenced. The British moved forward in two columns. The Americans, like I mentioned, were about 4 or 5 miles outside the city of New Orleans at Chalmette, Louisiana. The front line was at the Rodriguez Canal, which Bill described, basically describing it as like a moat. Right, and the Rodriguez Canal, or this moat more or less, stretched from the Mississippi River to a swamp, making it impossible to outflank. The West Bank Battery, which I mentioned, that battery on the other side of the Mississippi River, had 20 guns protecting the American lines from the river. So here's the British plan. The British plan was to attack that battery, win it, then turn the guns on the American lines, and open up enfilading fire. Enfilading fire is basically when you fire guns right along the lines. So you've totally outflanked them by 90 degrees and you're firing across the line. So that was the idea, that they would take these and then turn them on the American line. Meanwhile, while the British were doing this, heading across the river to take this West Bank battery, they would be sending troops at what they deemed to be the weak point in the line, which was toward the right side of the battlefield from the British perspective, along the swamp.
Now, Chris, this is let's pause here. Do you know why they were attacking that supposed weak point in the American line?
Was it because was there a deserter?
That's right.
Who told them that?
That's right. So in the War of 1812, a forgotten conflict, that I read for purposes of this.
We didn't forget it.
Donald Hickey's book. It was a footnote that they were targeting that portion of the American line because an American deserter had identified that to them as the weak point because it was filled with just militia.
Gotcha. Very good.
There was method,
and that would make sense.
And it makes sense. It does make sense, right? Because you start from the premise that they already think once they see British troops, they're going to turn and run. Then you couple it with the fact that they're not even regulars, and it's going to be a rout.
Yeah. Well, you also have to remember that the British expected that they would have either be on the verge of or have already taken this battery on the West Bank, too.
Also
so
true.
then they would have artillery fire flanking them, right? This enfilade fire. So this was the plan. Colonel William Thornton was to cross the Mississippi River during the night/early morning of January 8th, 1815, with a force of almost 800 men and then storm the battery. These men, of course, like I mentioned, were supposed to be supporting the frontal attack, but there's a problem. The British tried to create a makeshift canal to get themselves to the river and the boats to the river, but it wasn't quite working out. They ended up leaving about 12 hours late with only half of the amount of boats that they needed. So the frontal attack the British were about to execute, and the other column marching along the bank did not have the supporting enfilade fire that they had hoped to have. But the British, being the British and really drinking their own Kool-Aid, decided to move forward with it anyway. As the sun rose and the Americans could see the approaching British, they rained fire upon them. So here we have the Rodriguez Canal, which was about 8 feet deep and 15 feet wide. And then on the other side of that canal, as you mentioned, Bill, there were parapets. There was a wall, which was anywhere from like 6 to 8 feet tall. So you can imagine if you're approaching an 8-foot deep, 15-foot wide canal that on the other side of it has an 8-foot high wall, how difficult that would be to scale. I mean, some people have problems pulling themselves up out of the pool with a wall that is about 6 inches above the water. You can't imagine how difficult it would be if it were 6 to 8 feet above the water. But the British weren't totally blind to all of this. Do you remember what their plan was, Bill?
They didn't have, there wasn't like a makeshift or like a mechanical bridge that you could just summon to the front at this point in time. But they thought about this, right? So it was like they fastened sugar cane stalks together for this.
Yeah. To create like fascines.
Yeah. Well, that's the fancy word for it. But fastened sugar cane stalks together is the colloquial term. And they were going to use it like a makeshift bridge to get to the other side of the moat.
Yes, that was the plan. And they had ladders too. Right? So they weren't totally... They were expecting this, but it was still going to be extremely difficult. And things become harder for the British because Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Mullins, who's in charge of the 44th Regiment, his job was to take the fascines and the ladders and get everything set up for the troops trailing behind them. And I'm sorry, I shouldn't be laughing because this truly was... Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Mullins goes down the history books for the wrong reasons, and I feel bad for him. But he started on his approach toward the American lines, got about halfway there, and realized, oh crap, we forgot the fascines and the ladders. And so they went back to go get them, right? He sent his men back to go get them because they needed these to get over the walls. The problem is that the other British lines didn't realize it or chose to push forward anyway, and they kept marching. So the 44th Regiment, which was supposed to be in front of them, basically like taking fire too, right? Sort of sacrificial lambs, and set these ladders and fascines up, weren't there. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. So as the British were pushing forward, they ended up being sitting ducks with nowhere to go and no realistic chance of climbing over the American defenses. So you have the 43rd Light Infantry, the 7th Royal Fusiliers, and the 21st and the 4th all charging at this weak point toward the canal, and then you have the 95th Rifles too. But in the end, you have rifles from the Americans and artillery raining down on them. Now, Bill, do you remember the 93rd Highlanders were the ones that were supposed to be going right along the bank of the Mississippi? And do you remember what, like, the audible that the British called?
Yeah, so we've described this situation. It's not a great situation for the British, right? And that's if you're trying.
I would say that not great is an accurate way to describe it. Yes,
these troops, these units, they just got done finishing off Napoleon, so they're not like scrubs. Like these are battle-hardened European theater troops. So this,
I mean, no Americans. But
yeah. But this unit, the Highlanders, they were not just asked to make a direct frontal assault against the American line. They were asked to then march horizontally across enemy fire to then support the failing British advance towards the center of the line. So imagine that.
Yes.
You're not just trying to move forward, because you're always trying. You got to move forward. That's you got to advance. Chris, we're both football fans. I use this analogy.
I am. I almost, by the way, for the record, I considered going to the NFL, but I decided to teach instead.
I think that is a selfless act. The world needed to know about this.
Yes. Anyway, carry on.
So
it was one of my career options.
When you're watching a runner, maybe not Lamar Jackson, but when you're watching a runner with a football, and that runner starts going east-west, side to side. Yes. That runner's typically in trouble, correct?
Typically. You want that Sam's Lamar Jackson? Yes.
You want that runner going north-south. You want that runner to advance the football as fast as possible, because the fastest way to any point is a direct line. Same thing here, only that Highlander unit was under intense artillery and rifle fire and going sideways. So
well, they were going diagonal. They were going like diagonal toward that weak point, right? So what the British did is they recognized their advance wasn't really working. They weren't breaking through the wall like they had hoped, which sort of has to do with Chucklehead Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Mullins forgetting the ladders and the fascines, which was like, you have one job, dude. What are you doing? So then they send the 93rd Highlanders diagonal toward that point. But here's the thing, Bill, is not only are the Highlanders just sitting ducks, I mean, getting rained upon, and we stood up on the American defenses when we were down at the battlefield, and we were looking out at the field and just imagining like having to march through the high grass diagonally across this field, and just how dangerous that would be. But on top of that, and this blunted the British attack even more, because when the Highlanders went diagonally across the field, they also blocked the British artillery from firing, because then the British artillery would have potentially been firing on their own men. As all of this was happening, Major General Samuel Gibbs was beside himself, having been overheard ranting, quote, "When I find Mullins, I'm going to hang him by a tree today." The advance along the river was a failure, with the British taking an advance redoubt temporarily before getting repulsed. The main attack on the right was even more of a disaster, with barely any of the men even reaching the top of the American parapet before being shot and killed. Both Pakenham and Major General Samuel Gibbs were fatally wounded. Major Wilkinson then ordered a third advance, which met the same fate of the falling victim to the relentless, unobstructed American grape shot. A truly incredible battle. And by incredible, I mean the outcome was incredible.
Can I add three things? One fun fact. Well, I mean, one fact. I'll let the listener just determine if it's fun or not. But we've been talking.
That's good judgment on your part.
We've been talking about the British officer Pakenham for a while now. Do you know who he's related to?
Oh, The Duke, was it the Duke of Wellington?
He is the brother-in-law of the Duke of Wellington. This again, I mean, the officers and the troops that the British had at this battle were not pushovers. I mean, literally, the Duke of Wellington's brother-in-law was leading this battle. The second thing I wanted to say, it's not a fun fact, it's more of an acknowledgement, but Jackson's line at the Battle of New Orleans, you were saying the city itself was undefended, and when he got there, he had to rally an entire army, right? So it wasn't just regulars, Marines, Army, etc., but you had militias that came in from Kentucky, Tennessee, Santo Domingo, free men of color, Choctaw Native Americans, and finally, literal pirates defending that line. It's just an incredible collection of personnel that he was able to assemble. And it makes sense, right? Because Jackson, when he got to New Orleans, said, either you're with us or you're with the British, which may be the most Jackson thing possible to say at that point in time. So yeah, it's just Andrew Jackson, pretty force of nature.
Well, yeah, I mean, it really underscores just how challenging this was for Jackson and why the British were somewhat confident. Like, they recognized that this was a ragtag group of soldiers, but that the circumstances and the environment were just so overwhelming. There was such an overwhelming advantage for Jackson. I remember when we were at the Chalmette battlefield and we're standing on like the American defenses looking out at the battle, and I looked at you and Zach, and I can't remember exactly what I said, but it was something along the lines of, what were they thinking? Like, what were the British thinking would happen here? How did they ever expect to be successful in this battle? And it really is, right? It's a lot of hubris. But it was great strategy by Andrew Jackson. It was great execution. And you mentioned he had a bunch of pirates fighting with him too. And they have one hand and then a hook. So, I mean, they're basically worthless,
when you're 8 feet up looking down, I mean, even the pirate with one hand could throw a rock. I mean, my gosh. Yeah. Well, look, before we leave the battle itself, what that hubris got them, according to Jackson, that hubris got the British, according to Jackson's estimates.
Yeah.
British lost 400 killed, 1,400 wounded, and 500 taken prisoner, according to Jackson.
Incredible. Incredible numbers. Meanwhile, over 2,000 in all killed, wounded, or captured of the British, right? So, and of course, depending on what sources you look at, the numbers will be a little bit different, but it won't really matter when you hear the American numbers, because 13 American killed, 30 wounded, and 19 missing or captured, which would be a total of about 60 to 65. So compare over 2,000 killed, wounded, or captured to a few dozen. And that's what you're looking at in the Battle of New Orleans. And hopefully you can understand just why this became such an incredibly famous battle in American history. And there are a couple things to consider, and I don't want to belabor this episode too much because I do want to wrap it up here soon. But a few reasons why the British lost the battle, right? Number one, the Royal Navy did not clear the Mississippi River. It's potentially possible that the Navy could have gotten closer to the city of New Orleans and fired upon it, but they never did. They were too tentative as they approached the city. Number two, there's a 60-mile supply line for the British. So between the Royal Navy that was docked and the Army that was fighting, there were 60 miles in between, and many of those miles were across Lake Bourne and the bayou, so they had to go in rowboats. We talked about the 12-hour delay in the attack on the West Bank, the failure of Lieutenant Colonel Mullins to bring up the fascines and the ladders, Keene's advance of the 93rd that blocked the artillery fire, and really, I mean, just in the end, Andrew Jackson was a really good general, and we'll talk in detail about Andrew Jackson, both his strengths and weaknesses, personally and professionally, but he was a good general, and men believed in him, and he was more than prepared for this battle, which is a bit ironic, right? Because Andrew Jackson's known for being an aggressor and taking the fight to someone. Yet his greatest victory in his entire military career was when he dug in for a defensive conflict. 3 days after the battle, the decision was made to withdraw from the area and not to take New Orleans. Made by the British, of course. The official withdrawal came on January 19th. The British then headed to Mobile Bay, Alabama, where Jackson was ready to chase them, attack them, and continue into Florida. But news of the Treaty of Ghent arrived. And while it had not been ratified by the American Congress, it had been ratified by Parliament, and there were strict instructions to cease all fighting. And of course, the British weren't so confident anymore that if they continued, they would be successful. So they eventually withdrew to their base in the West Indies. So, the Battle of New Orleans was an absolute rout. Bill, why is the Battle of New Orleans so important in American history if it was fought at the very, very end of a war and arguably even after the war was already over?
I think this is one in an early litany of examples where legend is more important than the actual significance of the events. And what I mean by that is that this launched this battle, the legend of the battle launched a wave of patriotism across the country. And I don't think that can be emphasized enough. But really, I think that this is legend. This is Americana. What happened at that battlefield?
Yeah, I mean, up to the Civil War, the signing of the Declaration of Independence and the Battle of New Orleans were like the two dates in American history that were celebrated annually. Like, this was a huge deal. Not only that, when you think about the timing of communication back in the early 19th century, even though the Treaty of Ghent was signed 2 weeks before the Battle of New Orleans, a lot of Americans received news of the Battle of New Orleans first, and then very shortly after that received news of the Treaty of Ghent. And while you could work that backwards in your mind and realize that the treaty happened way before the battle, that's not really how people remember things, because memories are created when you experience something and have an emotional charge to it. And you can imagine why people would emotionally be charged to the sequence of hearing of the victory of New Orleans and then hearing of the Treaty of Ghent. Therefore, ipso facto, Andrew Jackson defeated the British all by himself again, which is how some Americans sort of viewed it, right? He was the symbolic hero, not Madison, not Monroe. Andrew Jackson became the symbolic hero of the War of 1812 and what some Americans called the Second War of Independence. So as you pack up your things, and we look back on the war so far, and next episode we'll wrap it all up with the Hartford Convention and the Treaty of Ghent. But I want you to consider just how divided the nation was at the outbreak of this war. The American public were not in lockstep. And we'll find out more next episode about a specific effort in Hartford, Connecticut to speak out against the war. Madison and Monroe were much maligned by many for their decision to go to war in 1812. And throughout the course of the war, they both experienced some public embarrassment and humiliation at specific moments of the war. But the Battle of New Orleans, America's eventual victory in the war, and at the negotiating table at Ghent, were unifying events for the United States of America. As Bill mentioned, there was a new pride in being an American in 1815. No longer were they the little brother on the other side of the Atlantic, the nuisance to Britain. They had now beaten the Great British Empire. Not once, but in the minds of many Americans, twice. And they were not to be trifled with. Madison will eventually hand over the reins of the presidency to his buddy, James Monroe. And throughout the rest of Madison's presidency, and through all 8 years of Monroe's presidency pretty much, this will be arguably the most unified period of American history. And this era of good feelings, as it is often referred to, was due in no small part to General Andrew Jackson and his victory at the Chalmette battlefield. Next week, Bill will be back on the pod, which I'm quite excited about, and we'll be wrapping up the War of 1812 with the Hartford Convention and the Treaty of Ghent. Thanks for listening, and hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed.